Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Disafami History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past, what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you. Welcome back to Disafami History Podcast, where we center Caribbean voices, history, and the power of our knowledge systems. Today's episode invites us to think deeply about language, not just as a tool, but as a site of power, resistance, and identity. Across the Caribbean, many of us live in linguistic dualities. We speak Creole in our homes, our communities, and our everyday lives, languages rich with history, creativity, and ancestral memory. Yet, in formal places like education, law, government, it is often English that holds the power or the authority. So what happens when the language of power is different from the language of the people? And more importantly, how can the language be used as a tool for justice rather than exclusion? In today's conversation, we are joined by Professor Clive Forrester, who explores the role of English in advocating for social justice within Creole-speaking societies. His work challenges us to think about how language can reinforce inequality and become a powerful instruction for change. Together, we'll unpack the tensions between Creole and English, the politics of language in the Caribbean, and what it means to advocate for justice in systems shaped by colonial legacies. Because in the Caribbean, language is never just language. It is history, it is identity, and power. So let's have a listen. Thank you so much, Professor Clive Forrester, for coming on to the podcast, Disafami History. And we're going to be talking about your article, Using English for Social Justice Advocacy in Creole-Speaking Societies. So before we start, can I just have you just do a brief introduction of yourself?
Okay, so my name is Clive Forrester. I have a PhD in applied linguistics from the University of the West Indies, Mona. And my research area specifically is looking at courtroom discourse. So for my dissertation, I investigated how well judges in Jamaica understood witnesses who were speaking Patois. I have been in Canada since 2008, where I first taught at York University. I was teaching Jamaican Creole at York University, two courses in Jamaican language at York University. And then I came to the University of Waterloo in 2016 and became tenured or permanent in 2021. And I'm in the English department, and I teach courses on linguistics, academic writing, and technical writing, and of course on Caribbean language and literature.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. And we'll begin, and we'll start off with defining what is language advocacy and how would you define it in simple terms but powerful? Example.
Well, so language advocacy is no different from any kind of advocacy that you might see in the public sphere. You know, it usually occurs because there is a possibility that speakers of a particular language feel that the government in their country, in their region, has no regard for the language that they speak. Fine. So whenever people talk about language advocacy and, language rights, it's not on an interpersonal level. It's usually at the macro level, right? It's a relationship between the citizens and the government, because that is where language rights instruments and policies are drafted. So sometimes language advocacy is necessary because, a speaker or a group of speakers might feel that the government has no regard for their language and they have no representation because of that at the at the level of the state. And sometimes a linguist, or even that same person, say it doesn't, a language advocate doesn't always have to be a linguist.
Mhm.
It could just be anybody, really, actually. In fact, some of the more well-known language advocates in the Caribbean aren't linguists, right? So that is what language advocacy involves. I guess a concrete example would be, for instance, a person who uses what is called Jamaican Sign Language.
Mhm.
And they go to like a tax office or whatever, they're a tax-paying citizen. They go to a tax office, they're trying to do some business, but there's nobody there to assist them because nobody knows that language. Now, a language advocate, and that could be a linguist, it could be a person from the deaf community, or maybe even a member of the government in rare cases, might decide that this needs to change and there needs to be some kind of policy to ensure that every Jamaican person who comes to the tax office is able to get services in one of the local languages of that country. And Jamaican Sign Language is one of those languages.
Well, that's good that it's offered. And you as well reference in your article the idea of social justice dialect. What does that mean? And particularly, I guess, in Creole speaking societies?
All right. So where social justice is concerned, there are a whole, I was going to say in Jamaica, a whole heap of different words and expressions and ways to talk about social justice and social justice advocacy. Now, be, and this might just be an accident of history,
Mhm.
but the bulk of the publications that deal with social justice on this side of the world are written in English,
Yeah.
right? So whenever people talk about things like, intersectionality and gender rights and human rights, all of those things tend to be written in English,
Mhm.
right? Or whatever is the official language. It's usually a European language of a particular region. However, this does not mean that there is no conception of or idea of justice and equality for a person who is monolingual in a Creole language.
Yeah.
It's just that that has never been documented. It hasn't been written down. It hasn't been expressed. So in the article, I talk about the conundrum of advocating for Creole speakers, but using only English, right? So sometimes there's a kind of disconnect. You're using a discursive tool that does not reflect the language of the same persons you're advocating on behalf of. So sometimes that could be a problem. Sometimes it creates
Mhm.
a kind of disconnect where the persons who start to benefit from the advocacy think that the advocates are not representing them.
No, definitely, because again, they're coming from a completely different perspective as opposed to the person speaking that language. Now, would you, I guess, define that, language then becomes a site of power or inequality?
Say that again?
Like, how would you define like that language becomes either power or it becomes that it's, unequal?
Okay. Well, in most societies, there is an idea of language variety, which is prestigious.
Mhm.
And that is usually the language variety, which is associated with things like the government, school, church, public, polite conversations. And then there's a sense of one or several language varieties which are not prestigious. And these languages are usually ascribed features like being strictly for private and informal conversations, usually not very educated kind of speech which does not convey complex ideas and so on. Now, e- even though this isn't always true, there's a perception that that is the truth.
Yes.
And as a result, people tend to treat speakers of non-prestigious language with, a kind of social stigma. They consider them not very classy, very
Mhm.
educated, and not worthy of the same kind of respect as persons who speak the official prestigious language of a region.
So then I guess this goes into my next question where, how does colonialism kind of shape this whole perception between these languages? Like for Creole languages where it's considered to be broken English rather than a distinct language itself.
Well, so these ideas have been adopted because of colonial history of Jamaica, right? Jamaica Creole is a language, for instance, which arose out of the contact between speakers of English and speakers of a variety of different West African languages that kind of belong to the same Niger Congo language family. And because of the setup of the plantation society, it was a system of subjugation, and as such, anything which emerged out of that new class of persons, whether it be their cuisine, their religion, their style of fashion, their thoughts about the afterlife, religion, whatever you call it, and language would be seen as substandard, would be seen as that as valuable as that which held for the colonial power. So the language attitudes which exist in a lot of Caribbean territories in particular are handed down from a colonial legacy.
And then why is it, why is it politically important for colonial powers then to deny Creole linguistic legitimacy?
Well, I don't know if it's important that they deny it, but it just so happened that they did.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. And as I said, this racism might be a part of it. Certainly the idea that there is no library of material in Creole languages, even to this day, people do try to publish things in Creole languages, but the official languages of Caribbean territories in particular have a very extensive library of, literature, philosophy, and different aspects of culture extensively written in those official European languages. Now, the absence of a writing system or the absence of publications in a particular language is not an indictment for the language.
No.
Right? Most languages have emerged and lived and died without ever having been written down. The writing is a development that might happen in a language, but it doesn't legitimize the language. But needless to say, a lot of persons think that, right? So from a purely socio-political standpoint, the presence of a writing system kind of affords a bit more prestige and status to one language than another.
Yeah. And I guess with social media now amplifying, of course, voices globally, has the digital era kind of changed the language debate? Or has it empowered Creole speakers to advocate more openly, or has it intensified the criticism?
No, well, the internet is just another medium in which a language advocate could channel their advocacy, right? The good thing with the internet is that you're able to reach thousands, if not tens of thousands of persons.
Yes.
With message about language advocacy through a simple post. You don't have to wait for somebody to, I guess, print your publication or approve your publication. You could start a blog, you could start a YouTube channel, and you could just work. Now, I think so that's both a blessing and a curse, because then you have persons who are not very knowledgeable about this area, and their audience members aren't very knowledgeable. So the audience members might misconstrue the views of this person as one of expertise.
Yes.
Fine. So there's a trade-off where that is concerned, right? So certainly when using the internet, there is speed, there is efficiency, and there is reach. And there's also a possibility that the information might simply be false. So, just as how you can spread advocacy and knowledge about language rights, people can use the social media platforms to spread misinformation and, amplify certain stereotypes about the language.
Yeah, definitely. And now we're just going to go into the language rights and what should that, or what does that include? Does it include in terms of, as you said before, access to the courts, access to education, or official recognition?
Well, so each territory will ultimately have to decide what that will look like.
Yeah.
Fine. Each territory has a different capacity for implementing certain aspects of language rights for Creole speakers. Some are a bit more further along than others. Haiti, for instance, has a significant amount of resources that are used to educate children in primary school, but Jamaica does not. So Jamaica has some resources, but this isn't something that is adopted in the primary schools in Jamaica. And then there are other Caribbean territories which have none, right? Even though there's a Creole language in the Caribbean territory. So depending on what, and of course, it has to kind of be grounded in what the population thinks is needed or is practical. Fine. Which is why I think that language advocacy that is driven purely by academics doesn't work. Right? It has to be something that the community wants. It has to be something that the speakers see as practical, fair.
So with saying that, we have, Miss Lou, who is the first major advocate for Jamaican Creole.
Right.
How did she use culture and, of course, comedy and literature as advocacy tools? And why was her impact so globally significant?
So she was one of the first prominent poets of Jamaican Creole. Poet, storyteller, singer, actor. And she made the language a very important part of her work. So the bulk of her poetry is written in Jamaican Creole. Well, it's written, her poetry is written down, but these poems are meant to be heard. They're meant to be heard and seen, not so much read. So, her advocacy wasn't the direct kind of slightly confrontational advocacy that some language advocates might have adopted in the 20th, latter part of the 20th century. But hers was, it used comedy. It used things that people were familiar with. And it was essentially meant to psychologically uplift persons who felt that their language was inferior to that of a European language. She wasn't trying to change policy. She wasn't trying to implement a different language of instruction in school. She was purely about consciousness raising.
Yep. And it was a bit more about pride as well, to take ownership.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
So pride, raising consciousness, raising awareness. She never lobbied the government. She never lobbied the Ministry of Education. For her, that was, not something that she wanted to do. Right? She was more concerned whether or not people would internally recognize the value of that.
Absolutely. Now we're going to go back to your previous point in regards to academics, because you mentioned about Professor Herbert Devonish and Carolyn Cooper, who also elevated Jamaican Creole academically. However, there was some backlash that they faced, and of course, resistance on the academic, political, and social level as well.
Yes. So in the article, I suggest that, a part of that backlash that academics who were language advocates faced, but, cultural practitioners who were also language advocates did not, occurred particularly because, persons like Hubert Devonish and Carolyn Cooper wanted a change of the status quo. Not so much Louise Bennett. She wasn't really trying to change the status quo as it related to what existed, from a government, constitutional, educational level. But definitely Hubert Devonish wanted to do that because he actually made a submission to the Joint Select Committee of Parliament to include freedom from the discrimination on the grounds of language into the Charter of Rights. Miss Lou never went that far, and I'm not even sure if she would have gone that far given time, right? Carolyn Cooper, of course, used her subversive literary style to challenge the dominance of English in society. And she too supported Devonish in his bid to really change things at that political level. So the academics faced backlash because they went that far.
Mm-hmm.
Cultural advocates like Louis Bennett, and others who use poetry, comedy, and so on, did not face that backlash because their arena was primarily the stage.
Yeah. Now, would you say that there were proposals for language rights provisions? What were some of the concrete measures that were presented?
So when Hubert Devonish approached the parliament about implementing the idea of freedom from discrimination on the grounds of language, one of the things that the parliament said was, how exactly will this be operationalized? What will it look like practically, functionally? And out of that deliberation arose the Jamaican Language Unit. And one of the mandates of the Jamaican Language Unit is to, create the necessary resources and frameworks that would allow freedom from discrimination on the grounds of language to be practically applicable. So you need things like a standard variety of the Creole language. You need to develop written resources, the language, oral resources to explain a number of different complicated concepts that the government sometimes communicates to the citizens, whether it is at the tax office or wherever, right? So that would need to be established for the provision to have any kind of meaningful impact.
So continuing on that idea, for the idea of actually teaching Patois as a bilingual foundation in primary schools, how would this benefit students cognitively and, of course, academically?
Well, whatever I say here, I'm not able to support it with research based in Jamaica, but research based outside.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So there is evidence that shows that children who grow up in a situation where the language of instruction in school is a language other than their vernacular language or their mother tongue, those children stand to benefit from bilingual education. So they stand to benefit if they are given literacy in their first language and they transfer that skill of literacy to a second language or even a third language. So that is research that was done by the United Nations Education and Scientific Council, right? UNESCO. I mean, this has been well known from the 70s. Now, the extent to which this has been attempted in the Caribbean is still small. So the Jamaican Language Unit did run a bilingual education program, but it was just with a few schools, a handful of students. The results are positive, but not statistically significant enough to kind of propose a wide scale or a national initiative. So the results are positive, at least where Jamaica is concerned.
Yeah.
But it's just not extensive enough to roll out a program where there's bilingual education all across the island.
Or even people just recognizing that it's a completely different language and to see it as bilingualness.
Well, yes, people do recognize it as a separate language according to the Language Attitude Survey, which was done and repeated. So it was originally done, I want to say, in 2006, and it repeated in 2014 and one other time. And, of the 1,000 persons who were interviewed each time, the majority of people considered Patois separate from English, which is significant, because at one point people just thought Patois was a bad version of English.
Yeah, that's how I grew up, not to speak it, type it.
Yeah.
So, and then because it's interesting that, the Jamaican Patois may be one of the country's largest cultural exports through music, through culture, through global slang. I mean, there's books written on how to speak Jamaican, and yet it remains contested at home in Jamaica. Why does that contradiction persist?
For a number of reasons, right? So the books which exist are books that are usually intended for tourists.
Yes.
So these are books which a tourist more than likely could pick up and learn a few phrases and use while they're visiting Jamaica. Once you start to create books that are substantive and, context and content specific. So if you were to, for instance, create a geography book in Jamaican Creole, there's a good chance that no people would adopt it.
Exactly.
Right? For a number of reasons. There's a practical reason first, which is you'll have to teach your teachers how to use it. Not because teachers grew up in Jamaica, mean they can teach in Patois. So a number of different things will have to happen before you get to that phase. And what a taxpayer sees is an unnecessary investment of Jamaican taxpayer dollars into a scheme which nobody asked for.
Mm-hmm.
And we are not sure what kind of positive economic yield this would have.
Yeah, but I mean, it's part of the value of it as well, and of course, part of the identity of the people, right? So, but now we're going to kind of switch gears here and go into your work as a forensic linguistics. And for listeners unfamiliar with that, what is forensic linguistics?
So that is just the area broadly that looks at the intersection between language and law. So it could be something like my area, which is analyzing the language and discourse that happens inside the courtroom. It could be investigating authorship, which is something that I also do. Looking at crimes which related to language, like libel or defamatory speech, or even hate speech. Right. So yes, that is what forensic linguistics is. It looks at the broad intersection between language and law.
Okay. And for you, like, would you be able to describe, how you assist Jamaican Patois speakers in court settings? Like, do misunderstandings happen a lot? Like, how important is cultural and contextual interpretation in the law when someone's in the court?
I guess it depends on where this case is taking place. So in Jamaica, I've seen instances where witnesses simply don't understand what the judge is saying.
Mm-hmm.
Because either the charge is so complicated or something else, right? They're just not understanding what they're being charged with. Or like one of the cases I've seen, it was a judge who was reading out the charges to an accused person. And the lawyer was trying to tell the accused guy to plead guilty to the first two charges, but not guilty to the rest. As, he just could not understand why, right? And of course, the lawyer wasn't in a position to explain it right there on the spot. And of course, the lawyer might not be proficient at explaining it in Patois. Even if this is a Jamaican lawyer, it doesn't mean that the lawyer is going to be, exceptional at translating these complex legal ideas into Patois because the lawyer was trained in English.
And then for, let's say, I guess, what would be the difference in your work, whether it's in Jamaica or, of course, here in Ontario, Canada, in terms of representing or trying to do the work that you're doing in court? Like, how does that differ?
Say here in Ontario, it could actually be easier. Because here in Ontario, the Ontario courts recognize the importance of giving an interpreter or some kind of language assistance to a person who is on the witness stand who does not speak the language of the courtroom. This provision actually exists in Jamaica. It's just that it's never...
It's not used?
It's people rarely ask for it.
Okay.
Right? Because you might feel embarrassed to be asking for an interpreter. It's kind of an indictment of your ability to use English. But there are no such qualms in Ontario, right? And furthermore, the interpreter could be provided to you free of charge here in Ontario. So the work of a linguist who is doing that kind of analysis, it might be a little bit easier, especially if that linguist is called in as an interpreter or to verify something that was said or some kind of transcript. All of these things I've done in the past on different cases. And there is usually no resistance in the Ontario courtrooms.
That's amazing, actually. So I guess you're saying that there's no systemic gaps that exist at all here, especially here in Ontario.
Well, I mean, there might be gaps somewhere because I'm not sure there's like an official registry of Jamaican Creole interpreters, right? And even if there was, where are these people trained, right? So I've heard situations where, like a police officer might simply ask some Jamaican family member to act as an interpreter. And not because this person knows Jamaican means that you're good at courtroom interpreting.
Yes.
Interpreting and courtroom interpreting are different. So the stakes are much higher inside a courtroom. You're dealing with people's life and liberty. So, so that's a potential gap.
Yeah, absolutely.
If and when that occurs.
So then how do you see, I guess, these language rights debates evolving over the next couple of decades?
That part I'm not sure about, right? So right now, if you were to ask the average Jamaican person in Jamaica, what are the top 10 priorities that the government needs to focus on for the next few years? Language probably would not make the top 10.
Yeah.
Fine. So at least where the public is concerned, language rights, language advocacy, bilingual education, those things are secondary to a range of other issues and problems that the population feels needs to be addressed before we get to that stuff, which is almost like a luxury idea, the way that some people see it. Right? So I imagine that one of these days, the Jamaican language will be an official language in Jamaica. I just can't tell when.
No problem. So, Professor Forrester, as we end this particular episode, what message would you like to leave the listeners that are listening today as to how they should look at whether it's Jamaican Patois or any type of Creole language in the Caribbean region?
Well, I guess, I'd want to say that everybody can be a language advocate, right? And you don't need to have an official title as a language advocate, but you are a language advocate if you try to spread the truth about language and about the fact that, the Jamaican language is not structurally inferior to that of English.
Exactly.
It's not culturally inferior. It's just as rich and as expressive as any other language. And you can use it to express complex ideas. Fine. So any person who believes this and expresses this is actually performing an act of language advocacy. And I think more persons should do that.
No, thank you so much for coming on and being able to speak to this, because again, this is part of people's identity and part of the culture. But again, sometimes when people migrate, they don't want that to be associated. They want to be part of the regular society, and so there's no hindrances. But there does become a hindrance because you're then somewhat so disconnected to the history, to the past, to where you come from.
Yeah.
Right. So I do appreciate your time for coming on and speaking about this, because it's important to me. So thank you so much.
No worries. All the best to you and your team and your listeners.
Thank you. As we come to the end of today's episode, we're reminded that language is never neutral. It carries history, power, and possibility. In Creole-speaking societies across the Caribbean, language exists at the intersection of identity and authority. While Creole reflects the voice of the people, their cultural, their memory, and lived experience, English often remains the language of institutions, policy, and access. But as Professor Clive Forrester has shown us, this does not have to be a divide. Instead, it can be a space of strategy, a space where English is not only a colonial inheritance, but also a tool that can be reshaped, reclaimed, and used to advocate for justice, equality, and representation. So I leave you with this question. How can we use the languages we speak, not just to communicate, but to challenge inequality and create change? Thank you for listening to Disafemi History Podcast. And if this episode resonated with you, share it with someone in your community and continue the conversation. Thank you so much. Walk good.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.